Thank you again for joining us. I am Kari Kovar. I'm the COO here at Helix. I've had the opportunity, obviously, to interact and meet with all of you. And Gates and Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. In the way of background, I think everybody is somewhat familiar that we work with our friends at Tyton to kind of help us understand what's going on in the industry and help us kind of navigate all of the challenges and opportunities that exist. And so as a part of that, we have asked them to give us a quick kind of 45-minute preview and perspective about what lays ahead and what's happening in 2020. As Gates mentioned, I do want to give a little bit of background about their experience and kind of what they're bringing to the table. Gates actually joined Tyton Partners back in 2011. He has been heavily involved in kind of the strategy and consulting practice. He's very experienced in kind of general management and strategy consultation. He has a great kind of success and track record for bridging the gap between innovation strategy as well as kind of practical execution, which I think all of us value. He really has been a lead partner on several of the strategy engagements in higher education with institutions, companies, and foundations. And I think from that perspective, we're excited to kind of hear his point of view. And he has led several innovation initiatives within higher education as it relates to digital learning and student success, and namely around kind of courseware in context framework. And then driving toward a degree, which is another organization. In addition, he's been heavily involved in advising institutions and companies in the higher education spectrum and space. He's a frequent author and speaker, which we will certainly enjoy, complete with jazz hands, I'm sure. Without the pom-poms, a little disappointing, but I think we'll get over it. And so with that, he also has been an executive at various places and working really again on strategy, product management, and finance. So for those of us that are joining the conversation, I know we talk a lot about student success. We talk about making sure that we're ahead of the curve and really pushing towards innovation. And we often talk about what do we do to really ensure that we're getting kind of a thoughtful view about the student experience. And I think Gates will certainly help us with that. In addition, we have Michael also joining us. And Michael is an associate as well in the strategy consulting practice at Tyton Partners. He joined the firm in January of 2018. So congratulations on your first year and or a little beyond, I guess almost 2 years now with the hitting 2020. Prior to joining Tyton Partners, Michael served in the Peace Corps as a preventative health educator in West Africa. He was tasked with identifying health shortcomings within his rural farming community. And during his service, he worked in kind of malaria prevention, nutrition, hygiene, childhood, and maternal health. He's worked closely with primary schools to help implement new health curriculum and introduce innovative teaching practices and techniques. And we are thrilled to have him be part of this. Another little tidbit for those of us that watch kind of some of the things that happen in politics is that he also was through Michelle Obama's Let Girls Learn initiative, heavily involved with empowerment, health topics, and promotion of education as well. So again, we thank you in advance for your great wisdom and thoughtfulness. We look forward to kind of hearing about the strategy and what you're seeing in innovation and how kind of higher education is changing. Awesome. With that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks, Carrie, and really appreciate the time that everyone's devoting. I know an hour of your time is very valuable. So we'll jump right in without a whole lot of additional formality, except I will add that my colleague Michael has been very active in evaluating the current state of institutions' efforts to improve student outcomes, retention, and degree persistence in our work together on the Driving Toward a Degree initiative, which we'll touch on very briefly today in the last 2 years that he's been with us in the firm. So I will jump in and give you just a little bit more information about Tyton and who we are. So as Carrie mentioned, we're an advisory firm. We're focused on the market of education, and we spend all of our time really living, eating, and breathing the nature and evolving nature of the field of education. We come at this from a market perspective. We have a fairly unique business model with an investment banking practice and a strategy consulting practice under one roof. We think that that approach provides us the opportunity to give some unique insights to our clients and to help them make big decisions in a market that is evolving rapidly. At the same time, we help leaders in education make big decisions. We also help them take action against those decisions across both of our practices. We have a mix of folks who are former teachers, former operators and executives across a variety of businesses, all of us passionate and committed to the field of education. We work with our clients in the consulting practice across a variety of different topics and project types. In higher education, we work with institutions, commercial and nonprofit providers, investors, and foundations. By working across all of those categories, we have some really unique insights that we're able to share. We don't exclusively focus on just working with educational institutions, and we think the diversity of our client base is part of what helps us bring value to the client engagements that we have. But with institutions in particular, we work on issues related to revenue diversification and growth. We help them navigate opportunities to create and launch new programs, and we help them evaluate opportunities for mergers or transformative affiliations. And we also work with institutions on business planning or initiative planning related to sort of particular change or transformation agendas related to teaching and learning or student success. So what are we going to address today? So we're going to cover 4 topics today. We are going to move quickly for the first 2, and then we'll hit the halftime show, as Carrie mentioned, and then we'll pause for some Q&A, and then we'll jump into the 3rd and 4th sections. I will try to keep us moving relatively quickly, but look forward to your questions when we get to those stopping points. So the first is, who are the students and how are their needs evolving? So after a period of significant increase in the marketplace, we are seeing an interesting dynamic occur with respect to the growing diversity of students in the marketplace. This particular chart looks at the growth in high school graduates historically from 2000 to up to 2020. The students entering the college market from high school has grown at a relatively slow rate of 1.2%, but as many people have documented in the press and so forth, that population is expected to start to decline, in particular beginning in about the year 2025. At the same time, we expect the diversity of the student body to continue to be rich. And so in light of a sort of shrinking pie, if you will, of high school populations, we're seeing a continued evolution as institutions think about who they will be looking to serve. So who are they trying to serve? The undergraduate population is diverse economically, generationally, and increasingly likely to be balancing work and studying at the same time. These 4 charts look at the student demographics that we've observed since 2010. The white population as a percent of total is shrinking from 2010 to 2018. The non-white is growing significantly. The Pell eligible population has grown decently, although flattened off more recently in terms of the portion of the population that they represent. In general, in comparison to 2010, we're looking at a student population that is generally lower income as compared to the pre-recession student population. The mix of enrollment, full-time to part-time, has not moved all that much. I think what we've seen increasingly, though, are the demands that those part-time students have on their time have continued to become increasingly complex. That's in part due to the fact that we have an older student population, but also due to the sort of economic environment and the overall cost of education. Those part-time students have certainly fewer degrees of freedom in which to operate. And finally, on the age front, it's interesting to note that there's been a lot of discussion about the post-traditional student in the field of higher education. We actually see, while that's about just under 40% of the student population, that portion is growing. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But as we think about the changing sort of face and shape of the student body, we think that new strategies and tools are necessary to keep up with this population as it changes for both teaching and support in service of student success. So across the last decade, a lot has been made of the post-traditional student. Media coverage has blasted about the rise of the adult student. And while this is certainly an important dynamic, we feel it's important to call out that in the most recent enrollment data available, we're actually showing an increase in the under 25 population as a percentage of the total in comparison to pre-recession levels. The adult learner population we define as older than 25 has shrunk as a percentage of the total. And we think there are a variety of factors in play here, but recent enrollment has tilted back toward younger students. If we had more time today, I'd love to take a poll of the institutions represented on the phone here today to get a sense for whether or not you've observed this in your own enrollment trends. So what role should online programs play in your institutional strategy in light of this evolving student demographic? Michael?
So as we see, online learning has driven enrollment growth at post-secondary institutions, and especially interesting is the way that the on-campus enrollments have changed. We look at the graph, we see a lot of red at the bottom when we look at the on-campus modality, all across 2 years, 4-year public, 4-year private, and then the aggregate total. As we move up, we see blended exclusively online. We see a lot more greens, a lot more yellows there, which is good. But most importantly is the blended. And you see the blended has risen across all types of institutions and risen at a level of 6% from 2014 to 2018. So what is it? Much of the coverage is centered on online education and exclusively online education. But where we should really be focusing is this blended opportunity, where students that were traditionally on-campus students are, I guess, bleeding a little bit into the online space and giving them a little bit more flexibility to their post-secondary, to their higher education offerings and course options. And why do we see that happening? We see that undergrad online offerings can be a strategy to meet diverse student needs while still delivering on those outcomes and at a lower cost for the institution. And how do we know this? We looked at this is data looking at the entire universe of institutions. We grouped them into 3 buckets. We grouped them into the low percentages of students that are enrolled in at least one online course, a middle amount, and then a high, which is greater than 50%. We also split it across types of institutions because we know that the student populations and their motivations at those schools can be quite different. And if we look at the better outcomes that we see them in 3 main areas. One, an average lower price. Looking at the average net price of the percent of the percent undergraduate distance enrollment. And we see as distance enrollment goes up, you see lower average price go down. You see that same trend in when looking at the cost to the institution and how much they spend on education and related spends for their percent undergraduate and graduate distance enrollment. You see it move down for every type of institution, some at different magnitudes, but still moving down in a positive direction. And as I mentioned, they're not sacrificing outcomes. All across the institutions, as you move to higher percentages of students enrolled in online courses, outcomes increase. So it's not the question of, is this happening? It's the question of how will it continue to change, because the students are continuing to change and they're continuing to demand more out of their higher education offerings.
So as we think about going forward, what do we think online learning might look like in the future? And so sort of putting together our first section on the enrollment shifts and the demographic changes we're seeing with how growth is happening for institutions across modalities. We think about sort of online learning, online programs, 1.0 as being about access, flexibility, nationwide scale, and achieving a terminal degree. Historically, institutions have been able to deliver to their students greater access, greater flexibility. This has driven enrollment gains. It's helped to enable the part-time student or the working adult to achieve degrees at rates that wouldn't have been possible without the online modality. Institutions have historically grappled to market themselves on a nationwide basis. As a result of the online modality, institutions see the nation as their market, as their catchment area. And from a terminal degree perspective, whether it's about completing your degree that you started at one time, or starting from scratch and going all the way through, the brass ring at the end is that terminal degree. We would argue that in the future, the next version of online learning is going to turn many of these factors on their heads a bit. So we think increasingly online learning in higher education is going to be about price point and credential diversity, personalization, competing at a local level or in a micro kind of way, and then finally about continued or lifelong learning. These are buzzwords we see in the field today, so I want to unpack those just a little bit and then pause to see if we have any questions. So from a price point and credential diversity perspective, we think it's increasingly important for students to be able to consume education at a price point and for a credential at a rate that matches their evolving set of learning needs. Increasingly, the lines between work and learning are blurring. And so as a result, we think it's increasingly important to package our educational offerings in a way that align to those needs of that working student. Personalization 2.0 can be about a lot of different things. Historically, we might have thought about serving up content in a way that remediates against a student's particular gaps in their understanding. We think that's one element of personalization. The second element of personalization, though, will increasingly be about context. And so if I'm a nursing student and I'm trying to work my way through that first nursing degree, what are my needs as it relates to math? Historically, I would have needed to pass college level algebra. There's an open question today as to whether or not that should be a requirement, or what new forms of quantitative reasoning would be expected of me given the terminal degree or credential that I'm looking for. That context is important. There's another layer of it. In the context of learning quantitative reasoning, wouldn't it be a lot more helpful if I can understand the nature of the quantitative reasoning skills in the context of the career that I aspire to enter? And so that's personalization 2.0 from our framing. Third element is around local scale. Increasingly, the cost of technology, the availability of online courses and programs is driving toward a sort of lower cost to enter the online learning market. By the same token, we think it's becoming increasingly important for institutions to define the profile of the student they're looking to attract, and to define, either on the basis of geography or some other parameter, a quote local market that you're trying to serve. We think you can do it cost effectively, and increasingly institutions that are marketing themselves on a nationwide basis are struggling to do so in an economic way, given the level of competition that exists on a nationwide basis. So thinking about how you compete on a micro level, we think is an important dynamic to the future. And then finally, on lifelong learning, this is obviously in response to the dynamic that students increasingly are going to need different levels of learning as their career and lives progress. Institutions have an opportunity to establish that relationship over a longer period of time. This is an area where, you know, higher ed has a great opportunity where there has been relatively little progress. Continuing education units, as they have been historically called, are designed in part to serve this need, but we would say that there's even more opportunity to really rethink how that lifelong learning might happen and how the relationship between that student and that institution can continue over a period of time. So putting the two first sections together, that's how we see the students' needs evolving, and how online we think is a critical component to meeting those needs. With that, I'll pause briefly for a couple of questions or comments. I know there's been a couple things written in the chat field, but happy to take any questions from the audience.
Awesome. So I'll kind of jump in here, Gates, if that's okay. And Michael, so I believe, let's see, Christina asked the question, as we look at kind of the future and the online learning, what are you seeing as it relates to kind of certificates, boot camps, and endorsements or badges, right? How does that play into there's a lot of conversation and chatter about that. What are you seeing and hearing?
Yeah, so we're going to have a whole section on that. So I will answer it briefly to say we're seeing and hearing a lot. We think there's a big opportunity, but the models are yet to be defined. And so it's sort of it's a bit more of a greenfield opportunity for institutions, where we're quite bullish and optimistic on the opportunity, but want to also recognize that there are a lot of non-traditional providers who are also clamoring for opportunities in that space as well. We'll have a few slides on that here in a few minutes.
Awesome, great. Another question that came up was also, as you talk about kind of, you know, the marketplace, there's been a lot of players that have gone after that national grab, right? Then SNHU and WGU, so on and so forth. When you talk about really institutions that are going after the local and doing it well and kind of refining and or adjusting maybe their offering to really meet that local market. Do you have any examples of institutions that are doing that? And can you give us some insight on that?
Sure. So I mean local slightly in air quotes, and I'll try to give you two examples. I'm not going to name the institution to protect the innocent, but I'll give you hopefully enough information to give you a sense. So there was an institution in Pennsylvania. It was a Moravian Moravian liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. I think it was Moravian. It might have been another relatively small Protestant denomination, but anyway, they launched their first online degree program was a BA in cybersecurity. And I thought, gosh, cybersecurity could not be a more crowded space, while the needs are huge, there certainly are enormous labor market implications around the cybersecurity talent pool. Why would a small institution in rural Pennsylvania be interested in offering this program? So as I dug a little deeper, it turns out that for that institution, they only need, 10 to 15 to 20 students per year to kind of make the difference between break even and not break even. And what they were observing was that there was a community college about 20 miles, 30 miles to the west of them that had launched a program in cybersecurity, and in their kind of FAFSA competitor lists, they were beginning to see themselves losing to students who were interested in going to a community college. And for this institution, as a liberal arts four-year institution, they would not have thought about that institution traditionally as a competitor. And so that was their motivation, and that was the way in which they were thinking about competing on a local basis. The other very quick example I'll give you is we're doing some work right now with a school that's focused on the graduate space. And the way they've defined local is in the context of very narrowly and specifically defined graduate and PhD level programs designed to meet very specific needs. So a program that they've launched recently that has garnered a decent amount of traction is in it's a master's in media psychology. And so, it's a fairly niche arena, but one that's that has some attractive dynamics, and they've defined that market as one in which they can compete in economically. But the reason why they can do that is because it's an online and distributed program.
Awesome, thank you. I don't think
thought
we
of a
have
third
any...
example as I was
yes,
talking, but I won't share it. If you're interested and we have time at the end, I can talk about the third example.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We'll have you keep going, Gates.
Okay, we'll keep going. So, so where does that take us? So the first two sections were really about, who are the students and how should we as institutions start to think about responding. We're now going to jump in and think about the role of the employer and their role as the payor as changing. So a lot is being discussed right now about tuition assistance programs, tuition reimbursement, even loan forgiveness as a mechanism for employee retention and recruitment. And at the same time, employers have a variety of needs in terms of reskilling or preparing their workforce. As we all know, we're operating in a historically low period of unemployment, and the hunt and the competition for talent is very high. At the same time, there are large categories of skills, large categories of jobs that are going unfilled because there just simply are not enough people with the requisite skills to compete and to successfully operate in those roles. So we're in a state today where the employer is increasingly active as a payor in the field of higher education.
Right, and for all the reasons that Gates mentioned and probably more, we see that that employers are increasingly offering these education reimbursement programs. And we see them in three main fashions. One being undergraduate educational assistance, another being graduate, and then the third being student loan repayment to get those graduates fresh out of their degree programs and into their companies to add value. More interestingly, we see why employees are using these tuition assistance programs, and we see that over 40% use them to keep pace or get ahead of the changes at their position that they're currently in, or to become a subject matter expert in the functional area that they exist in, showing that this investment by the employer to the employee, and the funding or the financing given to the employee is coming back to the company and adding value in a way that we'll take a closer look at on the next slide. So employers such as Cigna, the healthcare services firm, have begun to realize this tremendous ROI through these education reimbursement programs. So from 2012 to 2014, Cigna offered an educational reimbursement program to their employees, and they saw roughly 6% take it on. And we look at three specific benefits that Cigna saw in their of these employees and the effect that the education had. And in one, employee promotions. Second was in employee transfers, and third was in employee turnover. More specifically, they saw that ERP participants were 10 times more likely to get promoted, which led to a lower cost to fill the positions for Cigna. They saw that that participants were 7.5 times more likely to receive a transfer, also saving money for Cigna. And then they also saw that those that did not use ERP programs, or the education reimbursement programs, were 8% more likely to be retained. So it reduced turnover costs for Cigna. And big picture, they saw from 2012 to 2014 that they not only got their dollar back that they invested in these educational reimbursement programs, but they also got an additional $1.29. So as employers begin to continue to see the ROI and the effect that these ERPs can have on their bottom line, we expect to see more and more occurring in the marketplace.
So the question that I think we'll need to wrestle with across the next 3 to 4 years, let's say, is the question of what will happen to enrollment in higher education in the event of an economic downturn. And at the same time, employers will wrestle with the same question. And so what this chart looks at is the unemployment rate on the left-hand side y-axis, and total enrollment in higher education broken out by type of institution on the right-hand side y-axis. And so as we look at how things played out from 2005 through till the current time, a couple of observations. So prior to the recession, we see a growth rate of 3% for that's for public institutions.
Yep.
Yeah, we have a problem with our Zoom thing covering up here. Sorry about that. For and a 6.3% growth rate for two-year institutions, and then finally a 3% growth rate for 4-year privates. So growing enrollment prior to the recession. When unemployment hit its peak in 2010, that's the gray line going up to 10%. We've highlighted it with that blue bar down the middle. Things changed for the market in higher education. The enrollment was no longer growing and started to flatten off. And the reason for that is unemployment declined, the economy improved, and increasingly the kind of cost-benefit evaluation that, in particular, part-time and working students were making around their higher education choices started to change. When the economy is good, they're less likely to have time or capacity to want to invest. What's notable is here we are, 2019, 2020. We are at a new low in terms of unemployment. And the question is, are we poised if, in the unfortunate event, we enter a challenging time from a job market perspective? Should we expect to see the same growth rates that we observed from the 2007 to 2010 time period? Will enrollment blossom for various types of institutions? We think the jury is still out on that, and we're concerned about the nature of the employer relationship and the role that employer as payer will have in a market in which the job market is not as tight and as strong as it currently is. So what we're looking at here is a comparison of the demographics of the student population from peak to trough to potential peak. So 2007-08 was the moment just before the start of the recession. The unemployment rate hit its high point. Thus, we were in an economic trough in the 2010 to 11 period. And then looking at the demographics of the student population today, where again, we're at similarly low levels, average unemployment of 4.4% in comparison to the pre-recession level of 4.6 in 2007-08. The biggest difference in the student population that we would observe across undergrad and grad, part-time and full-time, age, and Pell Grant eligibility, at least for the undergrad population, is that in general, the undergrad population is of lower economic means as measured by Pell Grant eligibility in today's market than in the 2007 to 2008 time period. It's a great thing that students of lower means are accessing our higher education system, and that our institutions are serving students with these dynamics. We're concerned, however, that in the event of an economic downturn of any kind, those students, especially the ones that are working part-time and studying part-time, if they will have the same bandwidth, the same capacity to continue to attend school, or frankly, whether or not those students are going to sort of come back and re-enroll into colleges and universities in the same way that we saw following the peak in 2007-08 and through the Great Recession period up through 2011. So we're raising a question. We're not saying anything definitive here, but I think as institutions, we think it's smart to be thinking about what are the economic sensitivities of the student population that you serve today and the student population that you want to serve tomorrow. And to think about recession-resistant opportunities and dynamics. And for that, that's where we see the opportunity in alternative credentials. And I'll unpack that here in the next series of slides. So what is the opportunity in alternative credentials? You know, one way to think about it is it's a recession strategy. The reason why it's a recession strategy is because it's job aligned and in general going to be at a lower price point for students as they're navigating that. Now that's a broad statement. There are certainly examples of alternative credentials that may be more than an associate's degree, for example. But I think the extent to which alternative credentials are well planned and executed against market opportunities for the student populations that you're serving, they may be a helpful response to a potential downturn. So as we look at the market historically, we see relatively flat, but modest levels of growth in traditional credit-bearing degrees. We see sort of undergrad, graduate levels hovering around 20 million. This is the U.S. At the same time, we've observed actual credentials start to take off. It's that tiny gray sliver that we're articulating here on this chart. But if you look at the level of participation in informal type offerings, alternative credentials and the potential market it vastly exceeds those that are offered inside of traditional institutional programs. So to the question earlier, what's underneath this dotted triangle here, we think that's the sort of blue ocean. If you're familiar with that analogy, that's the green field of opportunity, where there are a lot of different providers that are working to enter that space. We have some specific thoughts about how institutions can play here, and I'm going to unpack those a little bit for you now. So several years ago, we were engaged by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to start to think about new forms of credentialing, and what are the kind of environmental or systemic kind of dynamics that need to be in play for alternative credentials to start to really take off. In the kind of like gold rush sense of the word, what are the picks and shovels? What are the wheelbarrows? What are the environmental factors that need to be in play for that potential market to take shape? And we would say that based on that research, you can access it at no cost at our website. The paper is called the Evidence for Learning in the Case for an Integrated Competency Management System. We would say that it's about aligning students, institutions, and employers against the 5 elements of this framework. And I'm going to take a moment to describe it. It's a bit conceptual in its nature, but then I'll try to drive it home to something practical here in a minute. Align is a process of securing feedback to enhance and refine performance capabilities. It's the feedback loop that happens at the end of a process, which starts with your learning experience. Increasingly, that learning experience from employers to institutions to students may be constructed in an informal way or in an experiential way rather than in a formal classroom environment. As the modalities and as the nature of that experience expands in terms of its structure and diversity, the need to validate what's actually learned increases dramatically. And so we see in an alternative credential market the really important role of assessment of a variety of types, valid assessments that employers recognize, assessments that institutions can cost effectively deliver, and that students are not overly burdened by, let's just say. So authentic assessments are performance-based tasks. Increasingly, those are the kinds of assessments that fit well in an alternative credential environment. Third category is around assemble. So to what extent, the overused term that we hear today is stackable. I'm not sure that stackable captures it all. The important dynamic is that students are able to curate and capture the evidence of learning that they have, and to network those learning experiences together, and then in turn, moving to the final stage, promote those learning experiences in a way that is recognized and valued by employers. So that was just a mouthful. The key question is, what do you all do as institutions to try to move this forward? I want to offer a couple of practical examples here where I've seen the alternative credential arena be very meaningful. As you kind of read down this list of the goal for the institution in the context of each one of these steps of the process, I'm going to capture the example for you. So several years ago, we were doing some work for an organization that develops psychometrically valid and legally defensible assessments for industry certifications and licensure programs. One of the programs that was launched, this was now several years ago, was in conjunction with a new professional association in the nursing field. This was for nurse anesthetists. It's a mouthful to say on a webinar. The Nurse Anesthetists Association had identified the need for this specialization because increasingly hospitals were wrestling with a labor constraint that existed around anesthesiologists and the need to deliver lower cost and more efficient care by nurses who could do many of the same things that an anesthesiologist would do, so long as they were appropriately credentialed and assessed. Why is this a reasonable example? It's a reasonable example because increasingly that professional association around nurse anesthesiology began partnering with educational institutions so that that credential would be an additional certification that RNs could capture in the context of continuing their relationship with the institutions that they had originally achieved that degree. So that's at the graduate level. Another example we've seen a bit more recently is the BYU Pathways program, which, you know, BYU Idaho is an interesting online program, online institution story, right? Serving primarily the Mormon Church and its global missionary population. But one of the things that BYU Idaho has done in the launch of BYU Pathways is at $73 a credit, they're offering this pathway program, which really they position as preparing you for a full-time undergraduate experience, but one that allows you to earn credit along the way. They credential it, well, they offer a certificate of completion, and they award credit relative to the courses that are taken at a very low cost and at a pace that works for the students that they're trying to attract to that institution to enroll on a full-time basis. So that credential, if you will, it's not really an alternative credential, I give you that, but they're using it as a lead generation mechanism for students to ultimately navigate into a full-time enrollment. But they're getting something that's marketable. There is a validation of that learning experience, and it is, as a certificate, something that they can promote to potential employers if they choose to go that route when they get back from their mission. So those are a couple of specific examples of where we've seen interesting approaches to the alternative credential market. So as we think about wrapping up here, I want to return to our original 4 questions and then pause. I know there's already some questions brewing here on the chat lines. We can jump to that here in a moment with the minutes that we have left. So relative to the students and how their needs are evolving, we think institutions need to take a deliberate and disciplined approach to their enrollment and student support strategies that account for the evolving demographics and modalities of the students. This is especially true in an environment where the available pool of students may be shrinking, as we talked about originally at the very start of our conversation today. So institutions, in terms of online programs, need to think about how these online offerings can be optimized for the target student that they're serving and the geography in which they seek to play. Think about moving from that 1.0 version of online programs to the 2.0 version. Alternative credentials is a key dynamic of that. On the employer payer front, I would be thinking through how the different economic environment might impact existing partnerships that you have with employers. I would think about what is your sort of recession response? What is your difficult job market response to the employers who you are developing relationships with today? And finally, we position alternative credentials as a potential good response to a different economic environment, but we think there's the need to be fairly thoughtful and structured in terms of thinking about the creation of new credentials, ensuring that you're aligning, with students and employers in that process. So I'll stop there and see if there are any additional questions as we draw to a close here.
Awesome. Thank you, Gates and Michael. A couple of questions that have come in related to and specifically around kind of employers, right? So for those of us that have been around a while and have seen kind of what this means and kind of the way in which employers are thinking about this, what might you suggest as kind of the best way to get the other 50% that hasn't engaged in tuition reimbursement for their employee base? What are some things that we should be using as kind of our angles or our hook, if you will, to get that not other 50% to open up and consider tuition reimbursement?
Yeah. Oof. Gosh, do we have another hour?
Plenty of time.
That's a great question. So, and there's, as you might expect, there's not an easy answer to it. So, so a couple of observations, as we've worked with lots of institutions, most institutions, employer partnerships have a long tail dynamic to them. Most institutions who have put people to work to build B2B partnerships have, dozens of employer partnerships. Each of them deliver 2, 3, 4, 5 students per year. That is a tough road to hoe in our mind. So what does it take to build kind of more deep and transformative employer partnerships? Excuse me. We think that comes from deep engagement with workforce partners in the communities in which you're operating. So I'm sure many of you are doing this already, so that's great. We think there are some very interesting kind of place-based solutions that are apprenticeship driven in combination with credit gathering efforts that start to become more deep in their in their nature in terms of the relationship between employers and institutions, and you're only going to get past that critical issue of size and scale if you're engaged in attracting students in mass. And you've got to do that either coming out of the military or serving a community that is an education desert of some kind. We've seen some really interesting work in the Rio Grande Valley in this regard. And so it's got to be place-based or kind of pipeline specific, if you will, in terms of achieving some scale.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Now, finding the other 50%, that was the other part of the question. Sorry,
Yep.
Finding the 50%, totally hard to do. It comes back to being a bit more place-based and looking for those strategic employers. You don't want to be the 6th institution listed on the tuition reimbursement program offerings. You're, and that requires a visionary leader on the employer side, and it requires, a lot of, effort on the part of the institution to build those kinds of partnerships.
And the alignment that these partnerships have, and that the student can see, I complete this certification, I complete this line of study, and I can get an increase in my salary.
See the ROI. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. They see what the time spent and money spent really can do for them in the long run.
Wonderful. I think for the most part, we've answered all the questions that have come in. I would open it up, obviously, to anybody else that is joining us to certainly unmute yourself and ask a question if you would like. Oh, they can't unmute themselves. Oh, they have to send all their questions to us. I apologize for that. So I will, as I am just kind of saying a final thank you and extending a level of appreciation to Gates and Michael. Certainly, we appreciate you taking the time, sharing kind of the information and knowledge with us. For those that are joining us, a reminder that we have recorded this session, so we will be sharing this out as a follow-up. And then certainly if there are additional questions, which often happens after you have some time to kind of process and consume some things, feel free to either chat with your AVP about the questions that you have, and they can circulate those into Adam and myself, and then we'll work with Gates and Michael and answer any of those. But we appreciate you taking the time. We hope that it has been helpful. And certainly, again, we want to thank you, Gates and Michael, for sharing kind of your information with us. And we look forward to 2020 and all the great things to come.